They called him the polite Englishman with a death wish. Berlin, August 1939, the air itself seemed to vibrate with tension. In the marble lobby of the Hotel Adlon, journalists from every corner of the world moved like ghosts in evening suits, clutching notebooks that would soon become war records. Outside, the Brandenburg Gate shimmered beneath floodlights. Inside, crystal chandeliers trembled each time a Gestapo car roared past. Sefton Delmer of the Daily Express sat alone at a corner table, stirring a cup of thick German coffee that had already gone cold. He looked like any other foreign correspondent, well-tailored, polite, with the faint smile of a man who had seen too much and learned to say little. But Delmer wasn't only there to write stories. His typewriter was an instrument, and each report a carefully tuned note in a symphony that only London could hear. He was the only British journalist allowed to broadcast live from Berlin. To the Nazis, it was proof of their own confidence. Let the Englishman speak, Goebbels had said. He'll tell our truth to his people. They didn't realize that Delmer's every word carried another message beneath it. In one of his first reports, he described a quiet evening near Wilhelmstrasse, where the Führer's convoy happened to pass. Those coordinates, once broadcast, reached British intelligence within hours. 2 days later, reconnaissance aircraft photographed the exact location. The words, "quiet evening," became code for enemy movement. But in that moment, no one knew except Delmer, and perhaps the shadows listening from the corridor. He felt their eyes sometimes, the Gestapo men who never smiled, never blinked. When he returned to his room at night, the telephone would ring once, then stop. A reminder that his life hung on a line thinner than any radio wire. He learned to control his fear by turning it into performance. On air, his voice was calm, almost affectionate. Good evening from Berlin. Tonight the city is restless, expectant. The cafes are full, the newsboys louder than usual, and somewhere beyond the border, the world holds its breath. Listeners in Britain heard only another dispatch. But to the trained ear in MI6, the pauses between his sentences carried a pattern, a pulse that meant mobilization imminent. He finished the broadcast, removed his headphones, and for a moment simply stared at the blank wall in front of him. Then, quietly, to no one. If they ever find out, my next story will be my last. The next morning, at dawn, tanks rolled into Poland. Sirens wailed across Berlin like mechanical birds. Delmer watched from his balcony as soldiers marched past with flowers stuck in their rifles. A hotel clerk brought him a note, "Herr Delmer, your presence is requested at the Ministry of Propaganda." He knew what it meant, access. The kind no spy could dream of. He smoothed his tie, pocketed his notebook, and walked into the lion's den. Inside, the marble floors gleamed like ice. Portraits of Hitler stared from the walls. A young aide led him through corridors that smelled of ink, leather, and fear. When he finally entered Goebbels's office, the minister greeted him with theatrical warmth. "Ah, our English friend. Sit, please. I read your last report, very fair. You see, truth serves everyone, does it not?" Delmer smiled slightly. "In time, yes. It always does." Goebbels laughed. "Good. Then tell your listeners that Germany only seeks peace. They'll believe you. You sound trustworthy." That night, Delmer broadcast from the studio the Nazis had provided for him. He read the official communiqué in his steady baritone. Berlin remains calm, confident in its mission of self-defense. But beneath that surface, another meaning hid. Every sixth word began with the letters of a prearranged code, spelling war confirmed. After the transmission, he stayed alone in the dark booth. The red, on-air, light had gone out, but he could still hear the hum of the transmitter, the mechanical heartbeat of deception. He closed his notebook and whispered into the silence. "History will not remember their truth. Only the echo we leave behind." Outside, thunder rolled over the city. The first bombs hadn't fallen yet, not here, but he could already feel the tremor of something enormous moving toward them all. He finished his cigarette, opened the window, and watched the searchlights crawl across the clouds like pale fingers. Tomorrow he would send another report. Tomorrow he would drink coffee beside the men he was helping to destroy. And tomorrow, the Gestapo would file another note in his growing dossier. Sefton Delmer, courteous, neutral, reliable. Possibly sympathetic to the Reich. He smiled at the irony. For now, they believed him. For now, his voice passed their censors untouched. But in less than a year, that same voice would turn against them, louder, sharper, and deadlier than any bomb. And when it did, even Goebbels would wonder how the polite Englishman they trusted had learned to sound so perfectly German. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. London, autumn 1940. The city trembled every night under the Luftwaffe's thunder. In the basements of the BBC, the air smelled of dust, sweat, and metal, oxygen thinned by fear and cigarettes. Yet somewhere among the chaos of bomb maps and shattered glass, a quiet miracle unfolded. Each evening, technicians huddled around shortwave receivers tuned to Berlin. Through the hiss of static came the familiar, composed voice of Sefton Delmer, our man in the Reich. To most listeners, his reports were simply journalism. To a handful of analysts from MI6 sitting 2 floors below, they were something else entirely, code. They called it, the language of shadows. The decoding team was small, 4 men and 1 woman who never gave her surname. They'd learned to read meaning in tone, rhythm, and timing. If Delmer paused for a breath after the word quiet, it meant increased troop movement. If he repeated a phrase twice, the subject of that phrase was military, not political. A single adjective could shift an entire report from ordinary to urgent. One night, as the bombs rumbled outside, the team replayed his latest broadcast. Delmer's voice was steady. Berlin sleeps uneasy tonight. To the untrained ear, poetic. To them, the key. The word uneasy matched a prearranged cipher, its syllables spelling out coordinates. When cross-checked with aerial photos, those numbers pointed to a new anti-aircraft factory on the city's edge. He reports the weather, one officer muttered, and somehow we get the Luftwaffe's blueprint. They laughed quietly, not out of humor, but disbelief. Somewhere in Berlin, under the swastika banners and the jackboots, an Englishman was feeding them the enemy's heartbeats. Upstairs, the BBC continued broadcasting through the night. Generators roared, typewriters hammered, and when the bombs hit too close, the staff simply waited for the dust to settle, then went back on air. London learned endurance, Delmer had already mastered it. In Berlin, the Gestapo listened to those same reports. They liked him. They trusted his tone, respectful, factual, never hysterical. At least one Englishman understands us, said a senior official. The Ministry of Propaganda even sent a note of thanks, inviting him to dinner. That invitation would change everything. Before his return flight, he filed one last piece from Berlin, a calm, clinical description of daily life in a city preparing for total war. The people of Germany, he said, go about their business with remarkable discipline. Even the children march in step. But between those words, between discipline and children, was another pattern, a pulse that matched the frequency of Morse. 2 dots, 1 dash. The message was simple, leaving soon. Mission complete. In London, when the signal reached the receivers, the decoding team fell silent. One man crossed himself. Another simply whispered, Godspeed, Sefton. He arrived back in England just as the Blitz reached its peak. The docks burned like furnaces, whole neighborhoods vanished overnight. Yet the moment he stepped into the BBC building, something in the air changed. The man who had spoken from Berlin now brought back its ghosts, and its weaknesses. MI6 debriefed him in a small office near Baker Street. The session lasted 12 hours. When it ended, one colonel said, "You've done your duty, Delmer. You can rest now." Delmer smiled faintly. Rest? I just learned how their words work. Now let's use them. And so began a new operation, one no army manual could explain. If Nazi Germany could hypnotize millions with radio, Britain would answer in kind. But instead of countering their propaganda with simple truth, Delmer proposed something audacious: outlie the liars. He would build a voice so authentically German that even the Reich's own soldiers would believe it. Not official broadcasts from London, not speeches from Churchill, but radio born from inside the illusion itself. The project was codenamed Operation Soldatensinder. He assembled a crew of linguists, actors, and defectors who knew every detail of German life, from the slang in soldiers' letters to the rhythm of military marches. They recorded in a secret studio disguised as a warehouse outside London. The walls were lined with blankets to muffle the bomb noise. Delmer's orders were clear: never tell the truth straight. Let them trip over it. And so, the first transmission began. A deep, confident German voice filled the airwaves. Guten Abend, Kameraden. This is the voice of your comrades at the front. It sounded flawless, patriotic, masculine, believable. But beneath the songs and news bulletins lay subtle poison, hints of distrust, stories of officers living in luxury while soldiers starved, rumors of secret defeats. In Berlin, the Gestapo heard it and panicked. Who is this? Who dares to speak for the Wehrmacht? They searched for the source, triangulated signals, arrested innocent engineers. The broadcasts only grew stronger. Every night, tens of thousands of German soldiers tuned in, thinking they were hearing their own. Delmer listened too, smiling in the half-dark studio. To beat a lie, he said softly, you must learn to speak its language better than the liar. The operation spread across Europe, from occupied France to the Russian front. Letters intercepted from German soldiers mentioned a strange station, Soldatensinder. They tell the truth our officers hide. For the first time, propaganda itself began to fracture. And deep inside the Reich, Goebbels demanded names. Who was behind it? Where did it come from? No one could answer. But Delmer already knew the next step. The voice would grow darker, closer to their own nightmares. And soon, he'd deliver a message that even the Gestapo wouldn't dare to replay. Because what started as journalism was now a weapon. And the polite Englishman had just learned how to aim it. Imagine dining with the man who could have you killed, and asking for more wine. Berlin, autumn 1940. The war had already consumed Poland, Denmark, Norway, and France. Yet inside the Ministry of Propaganda, everything gleamed as if peace had never left. Marble floors polished to mirror brightness, chandeliers like frozen lightning, and servants in white gloves carrying silver trays that never stopped moving. At the center of it all sat Joseph Goebbels, short, sharp-eyed, and smiling too widely. Across the table, his guest, Sefton Delmer, impeccably dressed, polite to the edge of irony. Around them, laughter in German rolled through the room, thick as cigar smoke. Delmer understood exactly where he was, inside the machine that built Hitler's voice. Every phrase, every pause in the Führer's speeches, every radio announcement that turned millions into worshippers, all of it was born in this building. Goebbels leaned forward, studying him. You English, he said, you have such talent for words. You make even surrender sound noble. Delmer smiled faintly. And you, Herr Minister, make obedience sound divine. For a second, the table went still. Then Goebbels laughed, high, sharp, almost delighted. You're honest. I like that. But tell me, Mr. Delmer, who do you really write for? There was a long pause. The orchestra stopped between songs. Forks froze in midair. Delmer looked straight at him and said, quietly, for history, Herr Minister. Always for history. Goebbels's grin returned, smaller now. He raised his glass. Then make sure history understands us correctly. They toasted. Cameras flashed. On the surface, two men sharing civility, beneath it, a game of survival played in code and glances. Delmer knew this performance was worth more than any article he could ever publish. That night, back in his hotel, he wrote in his journal. They think they've tamed me. They have no idea they've just handed me their microphone. The next morning, his phone rang. A voice, calm, official, told him his press credentials had been extended indefinitely. "Berlin values your fairness," the clerk said. "The Reich needs men like you." Delmer thanked him, hung up, and immediately packed his suitcase. He left the Adlon before dawn. His last act in Germany was to mail a sealed envelope to London. Inside, a list of names, locations, and coded descriptions of every propaganda broadcaster he'd met. When his plane lifted off from Tempelhof, the city below looked almost peaceful, churches still standing, trams still running, and swastikas fluttering in the breeze. But he knew what it was, a mask of order stretched over madness. In London, MI6 analysts opened his notes and stared. He mapped their propaganda system, one said, astonished. Every voice, every transmitter, every name. Delmer, exhausted and half-deaf from air raid sirens, only muttered, "Then let's build something louder." Within weeks, he was called to a nondescript office in Woburn Abbey, the headquarters of the Political Warfare Executive, Britain's secret propaganda branch. A colonel handed him a file stamped top secret. Inside were details of captured German radios, intercepted broadcasts, and reports on soldier morale. "What we need," the colonel said, "isn't just truth. We need confusion. You've been inside their system. Can you make one of your own?" Delmer looked up. "You want me to speak as them?" "Exactly. Become their voice, until they can't tell which is real." That was the moment the idea for black propaganda was born, fake German radio stations, crafted by British intelligence, designed to sound so authentic that even the Wehrmacht would believe them. Delmer didn't hesitate. He hired linguists, actors, and defectors fluent in regional dialects. They studied German soldier slang, pop songs, even the rhythm of Berlin newscasters. Everything had to feel real, not polished like Goebbels's broadcasts, but raw, human, fallible. He found his lead voice in an Austrian actor with a weary baritone and a smoker's rasp. "You sound like a man who's seen too much," Delmer told him. "Perfect. That's the tone of truth." In an old barn near Bedford, they built a makeshift radio studio. Microphones hung from wires, the floor smelled of damp wood, and outside the blackout curtains, the wind carried the distant growl of bombers heading for the channel. On the first night of broadcasting, Delmer stood behind the glass, arms folded, listening. "Guten Abend, Kameraden," the announcer said. "This is Gustav Siegfried Eins, the voice of a true German soldier." The signal traveled through the dark, caught by radios across occupied Europe. The voice spoke of corruption in high command, of officers living in luxury while infantry starved, of hypocrisy in Nazi ranks. It wasn't anti-German, it was too German to be dismissed. Within weeks, Wehrmacht soldiers whispered about it in trenches. "Did you hear the angry old colonel on the radio? He tells what really happens." Goebbels raged. "Who is this traitor?" he shouted. "Find him. Shut him down." But every investigation led nowhere, the broadcasts came from nowhere and everywhere. Each night, the voice returned, angrier, closer, more believable. Delmer watched it all from London, calm, focused, almost cold. "The truth," he said once to his staff, "isn't enough. They're drowning in truth. What they fear is doubt." His plan worked. The Reich's propaganda machine began to crack, not because the British shouted louder, but because they whispered better. And as his phantom station gained power, Delmer started preparing something new, a voice more dangerous than any yet heard. A voice that wouldn't just mock the Nazis. It would pretend to be them. And one night, it would broadcast a lie so perfect that even Berlin would believe it was their own truth. They thought it was a German station. It wasn't. Not even close. London, 1941. In a sealed basement beneath an anonymous government building, the walls sweated condensation and secrets. A steel plaque on the door read, "Psychological Warfare Executive." Inside, a handful of men and women built something that had never existed before, a phantom voice designed to haunt the enemy. At the center sat Sefton Delmer, sleeves rolled up, a cigarette burning between his fingers. He leaned over a map of Europe marked with red pins and said quietly, "We don't fight them with guns. We fight them with their own reflection." The plan was simple, impossible, and brilliant. They would create a radio station so perfectly German that even Nazi officers would believe it came from within their own ranks. Every word, every pause, every flicker of static had to feel real. The name they chose was Soldatensender Calais, the soldiers' station, Calais. It would sound as if it broadcast from occupied France, just across the channel. The studio was buried deep beneath London's blackout streets. No daylight, no windows, only the hum of machines and the glow of red recording lamps. The engineers called it the bunker that talked. At 1900 hours, the first transmission went live. The announcer, a German exile with the voice of a weary veteran, began. "Guten Abend, Kameraden. This is Soldatensender Calais, your station at the front." The tone was warm, confident, familiar. Between songs of marching bands and news bulletins, they slipped in rumors, shortages of oil, delays in supply convoys, whispers that the Gestapo was investigating officers for un-German behavior. None of it was technically false, just rearranged truth sharpened into poison. At first, even Delmer doubted it would work. But then reports started trickling in. German soldiers were tuning in from Russia, France, Norway, believing they were listening to an underground network within the Wehrmacht itself. The illusion was perfect. One Wehrmacht sergeant wrote in his diary, later captured by Allied forces. "This new Calais station knows more about our movements than our own officers. Someone in Berlin must be feeding them." The Gestapo panicked. Orders were sent to locate the traitor broadcaster. Engineers triangulated signals across Europe. The results made no sense. One day the source appeared near Antwerp, the next near Paris, then somewhere in the North Sea. In truth, the signal bounced through hidden Allied transmitters, its origin buried safely in London. Goebbels himself demanded an inquiry. "If this voice is German," he shouted, "then we will find his throat and cut it." But every search ended in failure. Meanwhile, Soldatensender Calais grew bolder. Its news bulletins began to mix fact with insinuation so seamlessly that even Nazi commanders started to doubt their own reports. One night, Delmer stood behind the glass, watching the announcer perform. The man's voice cracked with just the right mix of authority and fatigue. Between segments, Delmer whispered to his assistant. "You see that tremor? That's the sound of truth pretending to lie." They laughed quietly, the grim, exhausted laughter of people who knew their success depended on deception. In Berlin, the station became a legend. Some soldiers called it the honest radio. Others feared it, believing it cursed. A rumor spread that Gestapo officers who tried to jam its signal died mysteriously within weeks, an invention Delmer himself seeded during one broadcast. Every night, as bombs fell over Europe, Soldatensender Calais filled the air with its mix of music, rumor, and despair. Delmer's writers composed scripts that sounded like bored officers gossiping after curfew. They talked about girlfriends, rations, and the incompetence of their superiors. It was intimate, human, and devastating. By spring 1942, the impact was measurable. Reports from the front revealed growing mistrust within German ranks. One intercepted letter from a corporal in Tunisia read, "They say the Gestapo listens even to our laughter. But the men at Calais, they understand us. They know what's really happening." That was when Delmer realized his phantom voice had become something larger than propaganda. It was a mirror, showing the enemy what they secretly believed but could never say aloud. In April 1942, an intelligence memo reached London. Subject: German troop morale declining. Possible correlation to Calais broadcast. Delmer read it, then exhaled smoke through a tired smile. "It's not possible," he said. "It's inevitable." But victory came with unease. Each night, when the broadcast ended and the bunker fell silent, he sat alone with the headphones still warm against his ears. The echoes of the fake German voices lingered like ghosts. He once told his sound engineer, "If I close my eyes, I can almost believe it's real. That somewhere out there, the man we invented is actually talking. The engineer didn't answer. Outside, rain hammered the city. Inside, the light above the studio door flicked off. For months, the illusion continued unbroken, until one evening in May 1942, when something strange happened. In the middle of a routine broadcast, the German announcer paused, startled. A new frequency appeared in the headphones, faint, distorted, but unmistakably German. A rival voice cutting through the static. The operator turned to Delmer, pale. "Sir, someone's answering us." Delmer leaned forward, heart pounding. The ghost they'd created suddenly had company. And for the first time, he wondered, had the enemy learned to build phantoms too? Every whisper, every rumor, Delmer turned it into a weapon. By 1942, Europe was burning on every front. Stalingrad had become a furnace, North Africa a dying desert, and the Atlantic a graveyard. But in a basement north of London, war had a different sound, not of bombs, but of breathing, murmurs, and static. In a dark studio beneath blackout curtains, Sefton Delmer and his small crew prepared for another night of invisible warfare. At 18:59, the red light flicked on. The announcer, a German exile with a smoker's voice, leaned into the microphone. "Guten Abend, Kameraden. This is Soldatensender Calais, your station at the front." Marching music played, then a soft voice, calm, steady, almost comforting. "We hear the 118th Regiment didn't receive its winter uniforms. Supply delays, they say. Though some units of the SS seem to have plenty. No orders, no slogans, just a whisper of unfairness." Within days, Allied intelligence intercepted Wehrmacht chatter about shortages and corruption. Soldiers began repeating Calais' words as truth. That was the power of Delmer's invention. Every rumor carried a fragment of reality, twisted just enough to sting. He told his writers, "Don't shout. Just suggest. Let them finish the sentence for us." Each broadcast followed the rhythm of daily life at the front. Pop songs from Berlin, reports about sports, a few jokes, and then, the seed. "We regret to report that fuel trains for Army Group North were delayed again. Command assures us it's temporary." True enough. But to a freezing soldier in Russia, that single sentence was dynamite. Soon, the Germans began to believe Calais wasn't British at all. It sounded too real, too informed, too intimate. "They know more about our orders than we do," wrote one corporal in his diary. Another scrawled in the margin, "Whoever they are, they tell the truth." Goebbels couldn't stand it. He ordered an investigation. Gestapo radio vans combed occupied Europe, hunting the frequency. The signal seemed to move, Calais today, Antwerp tomorrow, then somewhere in the North Sea. Engineers tore their hair out. Technically impossible, they wrote. The station wasn't in Europe at all. It was hidden under London's grey sky, its voice bouncing off secret transmitters across the channel. As the broadcasts grew, so did the paranoia. Officers accused one another of leaking information. Troops whispered that Calais was run by a general who'd seen too much. Goebbels called it enemy poison. But banning it only made soldiers listen harder. Delmer watched all this unfold with quiet satisfaction. "We're not fighting men," he said. "We're fighting belief." His team crafted every word like a weapon. Writers mined real German reports, twisting details into psychological barbs. A missing ration convoy became a rumor of corruption. A delay in medals turned into preferential treatment for party members. Every sentence struck at trust, the invisible thread holding an army together. In February 1943, Allied monitors intercepted a German message. "The Calais station has caused unrest among frontline troops. Recommend disciplinary action for anyone caught listening." Delmer pinned it to the studio wall like a medal. But he never forgot what this kind of war cost. Sometimes, late at night, when the mics went cold and the static died, he'd stay behind, listening to silence. "They think it's just sound," he said once. They don't hear what it does. His engineer didn't answer. He'd seen the toll. Every victory left Delmer quieter, more distant, like a man haunted by the echoes of his own voice. By spring, Soldatensinder Calais had become a legend among German troops. The only station that dares to tell the truth, they called it. Frontline letters repeated Calais' jokes, its gossip, its small, venomous facts. Delmer's Phantom Army was winning without firing a shot. Then, one April night, everything changed. Midway through a routine show, music, weather, a report about the Eastern Front, the engineer froze. "There's another signal," he whispered. At first it was faint, buried in the static. Then a clear voice cut through the background, clipped, official, unmistakably German. "Achtung! This is an urgent order to all units." Delmer frowned. It wasn't one of theirs. The announcer looked up from his script, confused. "Is that a recording?" "No," Delmer said. "Someone's answering us." The strange voice was too perfect, every consonant precise, every vowel drilled. It sounded like Berlin itself. But it lacked something human, the rough edge of fear, the hesitation that made Calais so believable. "Kill transmit," Delmer ordered. "If we go dark, we confirm it's real," the engineer warned. "Then fade them," Delmer said. The man slowly turned a dial. The two voices overlapped, Calais' weary tone and the intruder's mechanical command, weaving together like dueling ghosts. For 30 seconds, the air crackled with war between illusions. Then the stranger signed off. "For Deutschland." The studio fell silent. The only sound was the low hum of the machines. Delmer leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Too clean," he muttered. "They've built a mirror." He scribbled a note in his ledger, enemy imitation, artificial tone. Over-rehearsed. Not dangerous yet. But even he didn't believe that. Because somewhere between London and Berlin, a new phantom had learned to speak. And soon, it wouldn't just echo them, it would try to replace them. It was a single sentence, and it almost killed the entire operation. London, late 1944. Outside, the city moved like a man who'd learned to live with pain. Inside the basement studio, the air tasted of dust, hot valves, and last chances. At 18:59 the engineer rolled the fader forward. The red lamp burned. Soldatensinder Calais breathed into being. "Guten Abend, Kameraden," the announcer began, sliding from a marching tune to a quiet bulletin about rations on the Rhine. Delmer stood behind the glass with his ledger open, pencil ready, listening not only to words but to weight, the human sag between syllables that made the lie live. Then it happened. A second carrier climbed into their headphones like a shadow stepping into a lit room. The announcer paused a hair too long. Through the bed music, another voice cut in, precise, official, without any of Calais' weary grain. "Achtung! Stand by for directive from Army Group Headquarters." Not in the script. Not theirs. "Hold the bed," Delmer said. The engineer froze, fingers over the faders as if handling explosives. The intruder continued, vowels filed razor smooth, all units to report equipment serials for audit effective immediately. A banal order, that was the genius. Nothing treasonous, nothing that would get a listener punished for repeating it. But if Calais aired it, entire regiments might argue instead of move. Delmer's hand flattened on the talkback. "Stay with me," he told the announcer. "Repeat the sports score. Twice." Sound bored. The announcer did as told. The two broadcasts braided, Calais' human breath over the intruder's metronome. The studio's clock ticked so loudly it felt like another signal. The engineer shaved a decibel here, a whisper there, starving the stranger without letting him die. After 18 seconds that felt like a minute of surgery, the foreign voice signed off with a neat, earnest, "For Deutschland," and vanished. Silence sat up and looked at them. "Cut to music," Delmer said. The announcer obeyed, lifting a scratchy dance band from a Berlin café. The room breathed again in a broken wave. In the corridor, the team gathered with faces wired tight. The script editor said, "It had our time slot. Our carrier spacing. That wasn't chance." The engineer added, "And not a single click of mouth noise." "Who talks like that?" "Someone who learned German in a classroom or a cage," Delmer said. "Not in a barracks." They shut the show down early with an apology about technical interference. Then the doors locked, the ashtrays filled, and the small, necessary cruelty of suspicion took a chair. MI5 men arrived with soft shoes and hard questions. Every drawer emptied. Every pencil counted. The announcer's pockets turned out a handkerchief and a soldier's letter he kept for luck. The engineer surrendered his spare valve set like a confession. Delmer said little. He replayed the tape, eyes closed, hunting for the seam. On the third pass he found it, not in words, but in air. Calais breathed after prepositions, the way soldiers do when they're tired. The intruder didn't. The rhythm was militarily perfect, and humanly wrong. He wrote in his log, over-rehearsed. Studio smooth. Grammar polished, soul absent. Then he circled a phrase, tone analysis. By morning, the political warfare executive's lab had the recording under a microscope of hiss and hertz. A technician with violinist's ears tapped the spectrogram. "Hear that?" he said. "No mains hum drift. Ours wanders a hair. This one's stabilized like a laboratory set. And the sibilance, identical every time. That's cut glass, not a throat." The memo to Whitehall was blunt: enemy has attempted to impersonate Calais via captured short idents and schedule data. Linguistic profile too clean, acoustic fingerprint inconsistent with field studio. Recommend, embed human noise deliberately, breath marks, chair creak, paper rattle, to authenticate. Delmer looked up from the page and gave a tired smile. "We win on the smudge," he said. "Not the line." The mole hunt still ran its course. MI5 tailed a junior copyist whose brother-in-law lived in Lisbon. He turned out to be guilty of nothing but better cigarettes. A relay operator who'd boasted in a pub found himself cleaning latrines on the night shift. The project learned, painfully, to live with doubt. On air, Calais changed. They laced broadcasts with imperfections on purpose: a cough at the wrong moment, a clipped consonant, a chair scrape under a joke. The announcer missed a beat now and then, and listeners loved him more for it. "He sounds like us," a soldier wrote home. "He even gets tired." Weeks later, intelligence supplied the rest of the puzzle. A Gestapo unit had intercepted one of Calais' brief pre-show idents and used it to gatecrash the frequency for a single paragraph. They had the equipment and the arrogance, but not the ear. Their German was too German. Their studio was too clean. In war, precision can betray as surely as error. Delmer copied a line into his notebook: "They threw a spear, the point was polished smooth, and slipped." Then, beneath it, the thought he did not say aloud: "Next time they'll roughen it." The team went back to work with smaller handwriting. Scripts grew more intimate, less grand. The station felt like a man at a table, speaking low so the sergeant at the next bunk wouldn't wake. If the enemy tried again, they would have to counterfeit not words but weary humanity. Outside, the world quickened toward an ending everyone could taste but no one could picture. In the studio, Delmer stared at the dead red lamp, fingers still on the glass as if it were the only warm thing left. "The war of words just got real," he wrote in his diary that night. "And we only win it if we remember we're talking to men, not machines." He closed the book, pocketed the pencil, and told the engineer, "Schedule a long one." "A long what?" "Goodbye." Because as Europe prepared for its last convulsions, Delmer began planning a final broadcast with no rumor, no poison, no performance, just a sentence sharp enough to cut through 6 years of noise. If it worked, men would drop their rifles and walk. If it failed, their phantom would die with them. May 1945. Berlin was burning, a city dissolving in its own smoke. The streets glowed red at night, and the sky above them trembled. Far away in London, under a quiet grey morning, a single red light blinked on in a basement that had outlasted 6 years of war. The engineer steadied his hands on the console. The air in the studio was thick, dust, coffee, and metal. Sefton Delmer stood behind the glass, not with notes or coded lines this time, but with a single sheet of paper. No propaganda. No tricks. Just an ending. "Ready when you are," the engineer whispered. The lamp glowed. The voice began. "Guten Abend, Kameraden. If you're listening, the war is over. Lay down your arms. Go home, if you can. If you cannot, wait where you are and live. That is the only order that matters. No music, no triumph. Only a steady, human tone." The same voice that once fed soldiers rumors and poison now offered them a kind of mercy. Across a ruined continent, people heard it. In a half-collapsed house near Cologne, 2 soldiers sat by a battery radio and froze. On a bridge outside Dresden, a motorcycle patrol killed its engine and just listened. In Vienna, a nurse whispered, "It's true," and dropped her bandages into her lap. Even in a Gestapo office with broken windows and piles of useless files, 3 men listened. One tried to take notes, then stopped. There was nothing left to record. The voice continued, softer now. "Those who are wounded, seek a white flag. Those guarding bridges, leave them standing. Those with prisoners, share your bread. If anyone asks who gave these orders, tell them no one. Tell them, the war is finished." For a full minute afterward, there was nothing but static. The engineer looked up. Delmer lifted one finger, "Wait." Then, faintly, a song drifted in, an old pre-war tune soldiers used to hum in bars. It played for less than 30 seconds and faded into silence. They ended simply. "Gute Nacht." The red lamp went dark. No one spoke. The engineer finally exhaled and took his hands off the board as if removing them from a wound. Delmer looked through the glass, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. "You know what's strange," he said quietly. "We won, without them ever knowing we were fighting." Later, that sentence would appear in a report filed under political warfare, results. But here, in this dim room, it sounded like exhaustion, not victory. They began to pack the studio, cables coiled, labels written, the ghost machinery of a secret war being put to rest. The German announcer folded his final script and left it on the console instead of keeping it. "Let it stay here," he said. "It belongs to no one." In the days that followed, Allied patrols found evidence of what words could do. Units discovered whole groups of soldiers who had stopped marching after that broadcast, rifles abandoned, helmets off, waiting quietly in the fields. In one report from Schleswig, a sergeant wrote, "They said a voice told them to go home." They believed it. No medals, no parades mentioned the phantom station that had disguised itself as the enemy to whisper truth. That was fine. The whole purpose had been to vanish behind its own illusion. Delmer walked out of the building just after dawn. London smelled of rain and coal dust. He didn't look back at the door, he simply pulled his coat tighter and started walking toward the river. He had entered Berlin 6 years earlier as a reporter, curious, polite, unarmed. He had left as something else entirely, a man who had learned that words could cut deeper than bullets, that a human voice could end a war more quietly than any bomb. Somewhere, across the channel, a ruined radio still sat on a windowsill, its dial glowing weakly, as if the transmission hadn't yet stopped. Delmer thought of that voice, weary, steady, merciful, echoing through the ruins of a dead empire. He came to Berlin as a journalist. He left history as a shadow, a sound the Gestapo never learned to hear.